Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Bray. I'll be chairing today's session. We're just getting a few more people come on, so we'll just give them another moment or two, and then we'll be underway in just a jiffy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Bray. I'm Assistant Coordinator of Energy here at Energy Policy WA within the wider DMIRS. Joined today also online by Sarah Woney and Madeline Powell. It'll be those two who will be taking you through most of the proceedings today. I'll be helping to chair the process, but expect that it'll run relatively smoothly. Firstly, thank you for registering and thank you for joining us here today. We're excited to be moving to this next step of our process. And if the team can just move me to the next slide, we'll start to get underway. So firstly, with this beautiful image of the Derby Yerrigan or the Swan River as it rolls up to the city of Perth, want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, and of course the traditional owners of all those lands from where you may be joining us today, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. What I'd also like to do is give you a little bit of a rundown of what it is that we're here to do today. So fundamentally, we're here to talk about the future of regulating embedded networks here in Western Australia. And the reason we're talking about that is because we know that the electricity sector is changing, and the ways in which consumers receive, use and manage their electricity is changing as well. New services are emerging in the market, and atypical electricity business models are starting to proliferate. For example, on-selling in embedded networks. They've been around for a little while, but they're evolving and becoming more common. Often these changes are good. Often these changes support the energy transition in terms of the bringing on of renewables and renewable support technologies into our system. And they can be a good way of supporting investment in sustainable energy infrastructure. And I suppose I want to start out by saying our intent is very clearly to make sure that we do not get in the way of that. And so by going through the process as we are, we're looking to elicit as much feedback as we possibly can to ensure that we get the balance right. But fundamentally, what is clear is that we want to make sure that we keep the needs of energy consumers front and centre in this process so that they can move forward with the right set of rights in order to support them, have good experiences, and ultimately support these business models go even further. So we've launched Sharing the Power. That campaign was launched on the 22nd of February. Sharing the Power is about finding the best way to extend consumer protections to these new and emerging business models and business model services. And fundamentally, given that we're talking about embedded networks, this means giving customers in embedded networks the same kind of standard electricity rights as other electricity customers. We can't say it more simply than that. I guess sharing the power is about just that. It's about a common set of rights across all users, whether they be an embedded network or not. And so I think that's very hard to disagree with, but noting that we are trying to get the balance right here in terms of how this all works. What we do know is that from existing regulatory frameworks, they're not always as flexible or fit for purpose for emerging business models. And so with that in mind, we've been developing a new framework, the Alternate Electricity Services Framework, and that's designed to provide more flexibility in regulating these kind of services. And so we're currently seeking feedback from stakeholders in order to get the best way through which we can extend standard electricity protections to customers in embedded networks. And it's true to say that we are considering all regulatory options available, and subject to your feedback, we think that this AES framework, or the Alternative Electricity Services Framework, can offer a good balance between ensuring customer rights while keeping the regulatory burden relatively low. So, with the agenda that's in front of you, you will soon hear from Sarah Loney, who's our Assistant Director of Customer Supply. She'll be giving a bit more context on the regulatory options and a brief project update. And then Madeline Powell, who's our Principal Policy Officer in Sarah's team, will discuss current consultation processes on the regulation of embedded networks. And she'll also give an overview of the recently released Voluntary Embedded Networks Code of Practice. So looking forward to going through all of those things. Because this is a fairly large forum, what we've done is we've turned on the Q&A function. That is, as you can see on the screen now. So please enter your questions there and we'll respond to as many as we can at the end. We've allocated reasonable time. We think we should be able to get through most things. Of course, you can also vote for questions that you want to support by giving the thumbs up icon, and that'll bump them up the order. Can I also make clear that this session is being recorded so that we can make sure that we capture all the details and all the input. So with that, I'll now hand over to Sarah to get us off and running. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Tim. So as Tim mentioned, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some of the regulatory options that we're looking at or that are available to us from embedded networks. So the context of why we're doing this is that essentially, as Tim said, most customers have electricity rights, but we think most isn't good enough. And we'd like to extend those standard electricity customer rights to customers in embedded networks. The current state in terms of regulatory options is the green circle on the side of the screen there and the orange circle. So currently we have the choice between embedded network operators holding a retail license. This would mean customers would get a full suite of customer protections. There'd be robust compliance and enforcement framework, and customers would have access to the electricity ombudsman. But there's also a fair bit of regulatory oversight and regulatory burden that comes with that licensing framework, as it wasn't designed with smaller providers in mind. So at the moment, most kind of these new emerging services like on-selling and embedded networks are done through license exemptions on the other side. There's very few customer protections for customers served by exempt providers. While we can put conditions of exemptions in place, and there are some, there's poor compliance and enforcement options available for that, because it is an exemption. It's an absence of regulation by definition. And there's no way to give customers of exempt providers access to the electricity ombudsman. So what we've done is we've created a new framework to provide a middle ground between licensing and exemptions. For those of you who've been with us on this journey, we've been going on this journey for a few years, but the AES framework is that middle ground. It is intended to provide a lower cost, lighter handed form of regulation that offers a lot of the benefits of licensing, but with a bit less kind of regulatory burden associated with it. So providers of services that would be regulated under this framework would need to register with a regulator, the ERA. There would be appropriate and tailored customer protections, and we have a lot of flexibility about what protections would apply for which services. There would be a light-handed compliance and enforcement framework, again, through the ERA, the Economic Regulation Authority. And we have the ability to give customers of those registered providers access to the electricity ombudsman if there are disputes. So where are we up to in putting together this kind of third option? We have legislation that is currently before Parliament. It passed the Legislative Assembly here in WA in November last year, and it's currently before the Legislative Council. We're hoping it passes Parliament sort of the first half of this year. And that primary legislation amends the Electricity Industry Act to create the framework. By itself, that legislation doesn't apply the framework to any particular services. Under that sort of top-level framework, we'll then have a few pieces of secondary legislation. Key among them are regulations that will prescribe a service as an AES. So as we go through this process of identifying services that we think this framework might be suitable for, we'll go through consultation to test that this is the appropriate form of regulation. And that's what we're doing right now with embedded networks, as Madeline will talk to in a minute. We'll also have an AES Code of Practice, which will be where the kind of the meat of the customer protections is where that will sit. So it'll be an enforceable code of practice that applies to anyone who holds a registration, and the obligations in it will be tailored according to which service. So then what does that mean for people who provide a service that is prescribed under the framework? They'll need to register with the ERA. They'll need to become a member of the Electricity Ombudsman Scheme, and they'll need to comply with all of the conditions of registration, the key one being compliance with the AWST code obligations. To give you an idea of what the timeframes look like from here, first of all, I'll note all of these dates are subject to change because some things are outside of our control, such as parliamentary priorities. But as I said, we are hoping to get the heads of power through Parliament by mid this year. Also, before I go on, I'll note that the time frame is it's not to scale. At the back end, the times are more compressed, just so we can show what's happening in the next kind of 6 months to a year and with a bit more clarity. The secondary legislation, we're doing the consultation now on embedded networks as to whether that should be prescribed under this framework or if a different regulatory option is more suitable. We are also doing that kind of consultation for on-site power supply arrangements, or OPSA, and there's a forum on that on Thursday. And we also have a consultation paper out for feedback on the policy settings under general AES regulations. And we have an information forum on that one for Monday next week. So please head to those if you're interested and you haven't already. But the idea is all of those kinds of regulations and codes, we are looking to do the consultation, finalise our policy positions and look to have something in place by around the end of this year. We'll then allow some time for the regulator, the ombudsman and service providers to prepare for that framework. And then we'd look to have about 6 months of a registration period after the systems and processes are in place for people to register. We'd allow them maybe 6 months to register before the obligations on them went live. So the regulations and the AES code obligations wouldn't bite for a while, so people have time to kind of come up to speed and get registered. I've skipped over the very top bar in this diagram quite deliberately. That is the Voluntary Embedded Networks Code. So Madeline's going to talk to this as well. But for those of you who haven't kind of been on this process with us, what we are doing is we have developed a draft set of code obligations for embedded networks if it is to be regulated under the AES framework. And we have put this out now as essentially a learn by doing exercise to test whether these are doable and workable and just kind of how they actually operate in embedded networks on the ground. So that is the Voluntary Embedded Networks Code. It is non-binding. It is purely for sort of learning, and Madeline will talk through the process of what happens from here, but essentially is to help us refine those obligations in anticipation that they may become mandatory if this is then regulated under the AES framework in the future. So with that, I'll hand over to Madeline to talk us through the detail.
Thanks to Sarah for covering that update on the AES framework. I'm going to run through some information on the consultation process that we have on foot, which is considering whether the AES framework is the appropriate form of regulation for the sale and supply of electricity in embedded networks. Excuse me. After that, I'm going to run through some information on the final Voluntary Embedded Networks Code, and I'll run through further some more practical information on how we're running the voluntary period under that code. So we'll just start with a refresher for anyone who is new to the AES journey, I guess, and our consultation on embedded networks. What is an embedded network? It's a private electricity network servicing multiple lots or tenancies within one property. It's connected to the main grid through a master meter, and the operator of the embedded network, the embedded network seller, as we call it, buys electricity from a licensed retailer usually, and then on-sells that electricity to individual consumers on that property. Usually each consumer has a sub-meter, which measures their individual consumption. Embedded networks can offer great benefits like reduced prices, usually because that ENS can buy electricity at a cheaper rate because they have aggregated the load of that whole embedded network. It also offers opportunities to integrate DER, distributed energy resources, more easily. Embedded networks can be found in apartment buildings, retirement villages, caravan parks, shopping centres, commercial office blocks, industrial parks, universities, etc. So just turning to the consultation that is on foot, I just want to have a another, I guess, refresher slide here, just sort of building on what Tim and Sarah have talked about already, and really the question of why are we considering additional regulation of embedded networks. I'll start with an example. If you can imagine two residential strata titled buildings, one building is set up as an embedded network and the other is set up with separate master meters for each lot, connected directly to the Western Power grid. In the embedded network example, each end-use customer is sold and supplied electricity by the embedded network seller. This could be a strata company or a third party under a contract. That person is operating under the class-based exemption Sarah mentioned for on-selling electricity. In the multi-master meter property, though, each residential customer would be a customer of a licensed retailer. So often a buyer or a renter coming into a property doesn't really know whether or not that property is an embedded network. And what does this mean? Well, we can see here on this slide that customers of licensed retailers, they receive protections under a mandatory code of conduct. They can access the Energy and Water Ombudsman for disputes, and there's regulatory oversight of the licensed retailers' behaviour by the ERA. However, customers in embedded networks don't receive any of those protections. So that's the question we're considering today. And it's really the key subject matter of our consultation paper. But just some, I guess, housekeeping on what a CRIS, as we call it, Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement is. This is a requirement of the Better Regulation Unit of Treasury. We're required to ask the question, what is the most appropriate form of regulation for this service? The CRIS considers in detail whether embedded networks should be covered by the AES registration framework, and it compares different regulatory options. It seeks feedback from you in weighing up the costs and benefits of the options to inform a decision as to how that service should be regulated. So really, our key policy objective with this work is to give small use customers in embedded networks access to electricity rights, including access to the Ombudsman, without imposing that unnecessary regulatory burden on an embedded network seller. So really, the key message here is that this is your opportunity to provide feedback on whether this is the appropriate form of regulation for embedded networks. So we'll just go into a little bit more detail on what the CRIS examines in terms of the different options. First up, we've considered license exemptions or individual license. Now, class-based license exemptions are really the status quo, and we've just grouped the individual license exemptions here together for ease today. In the CRIS, they're examined separately and in a bit more detail. Really, this is the cheapest option for embedded network operators as it has no additional costs, but it doesn't really improve the customer protections for customers of these services or provide access to the Ombudsman. Therefore, it doesn't meet the policy objective of providing those things to the customer. It doesn't provide for regulatory oversight, and there's no enforcement mechanism for non-compliance, which means the exemption no longer applies and an embedded network seller would automatically require a license. Even minor non-compliances would mean an ENS would be exposed to large monetary penalties for operating without a license or exemption. It also doesn't provide transparency over embedded network operations. There's also no price regulation for non-residential customers. And the alternative, using individual exemptions, would be a pretty lengthy process in terms of our office turning around those individual exemptions. And the same issues would apply in terms of enforcement and non-compliance. This option is really not considered a sustainable option and is viewed as a baseline in the CRIS document to compare the costs and benefits of the other options. If we turn to licensing, Sarah talked a little bit about this in that first slide with the three circles. Obviously, licensing would provide the highest customer protections with highest regulatory oversight and robust enforcement powers for non-compliance with license conditions. It would also provide the government with transparency on how many embedded networks are out there and how many customers are serviced by the business model. But it would be very costly for embedded network operators and would require onerous performance audits and reporting. Operators may also need to obtain both a retail and a distribution license, which would also increase the costs. Licensing is also quite inflexible, as Sarah mentioned before, and obligations can't be easily tailored specifically for a certain service, such as embedded networks. So if I turn to the alternative electricity services option, this we believe would provide a cheaper option for embedded network sellers than licensing. While there would be some costs for embedded network sellers like AS registration and Ombudsman membership and costs to comply with code obligations like developing standard form documents, etc. We believe that it would provide, due to it being able to provide standard electricity rights for consumers, access to the Ombudsman and regulatory oversight, it would meet the policy objective in the best way. Customers would receive similar customer protections to those grid-connected customers, and via a tailored code of conduct and access to the Ombudsman, they could have their disputes and complaints resolved in a timely way. It also provides government with transparency over the numbers of customers serviced in this manner and of the number of embedded network sellers operating. There's also the option of providing price regulation for non-residential customers. So all these options are discussed in far more detail in the series document, and we encourage you to take a look at that in detail. Turning to some other issues discussed in the series, it also asks some detailed questions about regulatory settings and transitional arrangements if AES were to be the option that was chosen. For example, it examines whether public consultation, whether a full public interest test would be preferable, or a fast track route for managing applications for registration. It also examines what the requirements should be, perhaps if a licensed electricity retailer also wanted to provide an AES service. It also considers what types of obligations on ENS should be subject to transitional arrangements, so perhaps a time delay, that sort of thing. So just some practical stuff on this slide here. The consultation is running for 8 weeks. It commenced, as Tim said, on the 22nd of February. It closes on the Friday, the 19th of April. It's open to embedded network customers, embedded network sellers, anyone considering entering this space in WA, anyone who provides services or support to an embedded network, such as billing or meter reading, and really anybody else who's just interested in the regulation of embedded networks in WA. On our website, if you go to the link there, you'll find a response template and a short information paper if you're time poor, which sort of condenses down the issues contained in the series. So now I'll turn to the voluntary code. So for those of you who, I guess, have been following along with this journey, this might be a little bit of repetition for you, but we know there's some people who are new to the consultation and new to the code. We have released a decision paper and a final voluntary embedded networks code. Last year, we ran quite a long consultation on a draft voluntary embedded networks code, received a lot of feedback on that, which I'll cover in the next few slides. But really, with that, after receiving all that feedback, the code was refined and a final produced. So we'd encourage you to read that decision paper and take a look at the final phone code if you have not already. So just as a refresher, this is the type of obligations that we put in the draft voluntary code. Really, they focused heavily on information provision and disclosure and a requirement to have a supply agreement with your customer. Also, the big headline items were, billing information, metering, complaints and dispute resolution, and what you should do in terms of providing support regarding family violence customers and life support customers, that sort of thing, and financial hardship. So if we spend a bit of time on the consultation, we did have a great response to the consultation. We had 31 submissions. Generally, the feedback supported our approach in using a voluntary learn by doing period ahead of the potential introduction of mandatory obligations where or if embedded networks were to be prescribed as an AES. The sort of headline items really that jumped out to us were improving disclosure about before people enter embedded networks, and generally that the current status quo, the license exemptions framework, is not really fit for purpose for embedded networks. We also received some great feedback about sort of different embedded network sort of models out there and different services that some embedded network sellers are offering, such as EV charging within their networks. We will also receive feedback that multiple tiers of embedded networks can exist on a single property, which was great feedback to hear, as that allowed us to really tailor the code to deal with that scenario as well. If you turn to the decision paper at some point, you'll see there's a lot of detail on the feedback we received, including a lot of customer verbatims. Sorry, not customer verbatims, stakeholder verbatims from their submissions. So there are some new obligations in the final voluntary code. We just wanted to highlight these for you here. There's some new pricing and disclosure obligations where an embedded network is supplied in whole by electricity from renewable sources, and where separately metered EV charging is provided by the operator of the embedded network. We've also improved upfront disclosure about distributed energy resources like solar, batteries, and EV charging in embedded networks. The intention here is to provide customers with a better understanding of what arrangements are in place at the embedded network prior to buying or renting. The amendments therefore sort of focus more on disclosure to customers and making arrangements transparent within the embedded network, rather than directing embedded network sellers to provide or do certain things with respect to the assets itself. So if I turn to the voluntary period, I'll just give you an overview of what's going to happen. The voluntary period is going to run, well, it opened for registration on the 22nd of February. We've had some entities register already, which is great. It's going to run until the end of September. We have the option to perhaps extend that, but we'll stick with that date for now. Some questions sort of that come to mind here we've addressed at the forefront. Who should register? So you're eligible if your organisation currently on-sells and on-supplies electricity to residential and non-residential customers in WA. We also note that in the voluntary code, our definition of ENS is the person who has the contract at the master meter for the supply of electricity. Now, we acknowledge that in some circumstances that's not that an embedded network may not want to have that person register as the ENS and have some other entity register. So that's permitted under the voluntary code. It just requires the approval of the coordinator of energy. So we'd encourage you to email us and discuss that, the eligibility there prior to beginning. We also provide for one embedded network seller to register for the embedded network. So as Sarah mentioned before, the voluntary period is really this learn by doing exercise. So we're trying to refine the suitability of the proposed obligations that may become mandatory in the future if embedded networks are prescribed as an AES. It's the opportunity to test those proposed regulatory obligations and for ENS to prepare for that introduction of the mandatory code. So what happens if you participate? Well, participation is non-binding and compliance with the code won't be monitored by us. You can choose to apply some or all provisions of the code, and ENS will not be penalised for not complying with the obligations if they choose not to. Please note that customers won't have access to the Ombudsman during this time. That's a key thing to communicate, I guess, to customers of those who participate. We will be in contact with all those ENS who register regularly. We will be sending a welcome pack to those who have registered with details of how the voluntary period will operate. And then during this process, we'll get feedback on the operation and we'll refine that suitability of the code obligations. So this slide just shows you the tentative dates that we're going to hold the workshops on that you can note. So we're intending to hold 3 workshops and they will be all online, much the same kind of format, I guess, as this, probably more interactive. Participants will be given the opportunity to raise a topic or issue ahead of the workshop. We'll request feedback on how you're complying with the code obligations, and obviously we'll send agendas out. Another thing to note is we may invite consumer or other industry groups to attend certain workshops if there's a particular issue that we think it would be helpful for them to attend and perhaps speak on. So the key thing with the voluntary period to note is that participating in the period is your chance now to have a seat at the table with APWA before any mandatory AES code obligations for embedded networks are finalised. Just waiting on the slide, sorry. Okay, this is the last slide, everyone. So this slide really just shows you how those 2 key pieces of work are sitting alongside each other and running in parallel. Obviously, the consultation paper and draft code comment closed last year. We've published the decision paper and final code, and now we're entering this voluntary code period. As Sarah mentioned before, the bill is currently before, the AES bill is currently before Parliament. We have released the series, as I've mentioned. Subject to that series and the feedback we received, there will be regulations made prescribing embedded networks as an AES. The period to register with the ERA would open second half of 2025, and the monitoring and compliance would be anticipated to be the beginning of 2026. So we've covered everything, and I've just put the main website link there at the underneath the, can't see it, underneath the questions heading there. So that's where you can access all the consultation materials for the series and the short form information, and also the decision paper and the final voluntary code. It's also where you can register to participate as an ENS.
So we've got a few questions starting to come through, and anyone who has a question, I encourage you to pop it in the chat and we'll answer as many as we can. We've got quite a bit of time for questions, and if we run out of questions, then we'll just give you back a bit of time in your day. So I'm going to start with the ones that we have at the moment. So Stephen has asked, in the Department Embedded Network example, how many and what kinds of complaints are arising from end users? So it's really hard to get a full picture of what kind of complaints there are and how many there are, because people are going to a whole lot of different areas, because there is no central place to go if you're in the situation and you have a problem. People will be going to their strata company, they'll be going to their rental manager if they're in a rental situation. We get people approaching us, we get people approaching the ERA, we get people approaching the Ombudsman, even though they don't have jurisdiction to help. We get small businesses approaching SBDC, Small Business Development Corporation, and then there's a lot of people who go to consumer protection. So it's hard to get the full picture, but what we do know is that there is this kind of underlying issues out there. A lot of the issues are about who is responsible for what happens if I can't get a complaint resolved, pricing, and getting information, how much information is disclosed up front and how much information is on bills for people to verify that what they're being charged actually reflects their energy use. So we did a survey of embedded network participants to try and get a bit of data around this. The results of that and the findings are on the Energy Policy WA website. I think one of my team might be able to put that in the chat or the Q&A response to that question, but it gives a bit of a sense of the kinds of issues that are being raised and the number of people who responded and kind of where they felt in terms of positive outcomes versus negative outcomes. So I do encourage you to take a look at that for more information. Have I missed anything there?
No, I think that covered it all.
Cool. All right, I might throw this one to you, Madeline. If a strata company does not want to become an ENS, what are the options?
Well, I guess, yeah, obviously a strata company can go it alone and do it themselves. That's totally fine. They can also outsource that to a third party, and there are service providers out there who that's their core business. So they're very happy to take on that business. And I guess that the cost of that is just worked into and agreed to by the owners of the building in the usual strata processes.
Yeah, and as Madeline said before, there's also the option if, let's say, a strata company wants to self-manage the account, but they want a third party to take on the ENS responsibilities, we will have the option for kind of someone other than the account holder to register as the ENS.
Yeah, that's right.
As long as there is, for the voluntary code, the approval of the coordinator, and when we move to the mandatory AWST code, if that's where we end up, then it would be the approval of the regulator to do that. So we may see third-party service providers offering that as a service.
Certainly from feedback we've received, there are many residential strata buildings doing it either way. Yeah.
So we've got David asking who is responsible for the meters in the embedded network? Will they need to be replaced? Also, is there a plan to cap the price that can be charged by the ENS? So in terms of replacing the meters, no, generally it's the ENS who is responsible for the meters in the building. We are not imposing anything that would require a meter replacement at this time. We know that that can be a very large cost, and we don't want to impose costs unnecessarily. In terms of capping the price, it's a bit more nuanced than a cap, but what we're proposing is a form of safety net pricing where there is a benchmark that people would be able to revert to, but the ENS can offer something different, and it might be more than that benchmark in some instances. For example, a time of use structure where it's more at sometimes a day and less at other times a day. And if that's something the customer wants, then they can sign up to that product. So it allows some flexibility for negotiation and agreement, but the protection of the safety. So again, if you have a look at the final embedded network code, you'll see what we're proposing in terms of that price regulation. And we've got a question, do you have any idea what sort of cost a strata company is going to incur to comply? Is the government going to assist with meeting this cost going forward? I'm actually going to throw that to another member of our team, Aurelie, who's online. So Aurelie, do you want to have a go at answering that one?
Thank you for that question. We have undergone a process to estimate the costs based on a range of scenarios, and we're estimating the cost to be between $10 to $37 per person. That is being serviced by the ENS. Now that range is quite high, so it depends on the number of registration and the number of customers, but it's estimated to be between $10 and $37 per customer.
Thanks, Aurelie. Sorry, there's quite a few coming through. I'm just scrolling to where we're up to. So Lynn asked if all customers in the embedded network are reasonably expected to consume more than 160 megawatt hours per annum, is registration of the ENS still required during the post-voluntary period? Yes, registration is still required, but the vast majority of the compliance obligations don't apply for those customers, so it would just be registration for the most part. And if you don't have any small use customers, you don't need to become a member of the Ombudsman scheme. So there's only very minor kind of obligations that would be imposed on an ENS providing the service to all large use customers. Let's see. Question about whether the recorded session is going to be available. We are recording. We have not yet come to a determination as to whether we will post this online, but we did for the similar presentation we did on the draft voluntary code. So I think it's probably likely we'll put this on the website after the session, so anyone who missed it can have a look later. Another question is, it seems unreasonable to expect a strata company run by layman volunteers to develop reams of big corporate style policies and then maintain and police these, or am I missing something? No, look, Stephen, it's a good point. We are aware that there is a bit of burden in some of this. What we're going to do is we're going to try and make it as easy as possible, particularly for those smaller players. So there are requirements under the code to have certain policies, like a hardship policy, a family violence policy, a complaints management policy, those kinds of things. Where we can, we are looking to have essentially a model form of the policy available on the website before the kind of AWST code is in place, again, if that's the route we go down. So those standard form documents, people in, say, a smaller strata company will be able to just pick up and use. They can adjust them as they want to, or they can just fill in their own details and run with them. So there will be a lot of resources available to help people kind of get up the learning curve and just hit the ground running. And as we've kind of said before, there may be professional services companies who will offer people the option of contracting for the ENS function to someone else. So if you just really don't want to be involved at all, there will hopefully be that option available to you as well.
I just want to add though as well, the whole purpose of the voluntary period is so that perhaps you could sign up and practice or test complying with the obligations without any repercussions. So it's a great way for you and your strata to, I guess, just have a go without any consequence. And you can feel free to ask us as many questions as you like about how to comply with the obligations. So that's the whole point of the voluntary period, really.
Yeah. And those standard form documents, while we don't have them available yet, we will be looking to kind of develop them and test them well before this framework would go live and mandatory. So Catherine's asked, the proposed definition of an embedded network is if a distribution system supplies to at least one customer. So is the intention to capture granny flats, etc., noting some other jurisdictions have a 10 customer threshold? Yeah, again, it's a great question. We have thought about this kind of, is there sort of a size that's small enough that we don't want to apply this regulatory burden? And I guess counteracting that is, well, we don't want some customers to miss out on standard customer protections just because they're in a really small situation. You could have someone who is a single customer who is in a sort of single customer embedded network. And I mean, like as in, say, there's a main property and then a separate property being supplied. And if they have a really difficult relationship there, do they have the right to, actually try and get some help with that? So it's still a live question, and we are keen to get feedback on it and where, if there is an area where that regulatory burden is too much. But we are also, I suppose, aware that it's a bit of an arbitrary number, 10, and we want to at least be able to capture how many people are through the cracks if we go down that route. So yeah, very keen to get stakeholder feedback on that particular point, if you have any. That said, we aren't intending for this to apply to things like short stay resident, like accommodations, and like hotels, even though they're on supplying electricity, they're not intended to be captured as ENS, or things like share houses, where it's an arrangement between individuals. We'd look to carve that out as well. It's really where there is a bit more of an arm's length on supply situation. So Dave says, I haven't read the decision paper, but I'm curious to know if this AWST legislation will also apply to embedded network providers over multiple green title lots within an embedded network. I see the discussion today is centered around strata lots or a single green title embedded network. Do you want to take that one, Madeline?
Yeah, so this scenario is specifically excluded from the voluntary embedded networks code. We're not intending to regulate at this stage this model. Currently, the ones that we know of that are intending to pursue this model are getting a license, a retail and distribution license. So we're really, the voluntary code is focused on a single property. As I mentioned earlier, there is definitely the business model of tiered embedded networks, and that can easily be captured by our voluntary code. We've provided for that, so you can have multiple embedded networks on the single property with multiple ENS, but crossing multiple green title lots, no.
So the next question, also from Dave, is if the AWST legislation comes into effect, do you expect all the legacy embedded networks will need to register and comply? And the simple answer is yes. We are looking to extend these protections to people who are currently out there and having problems. We acknowledge that not everyone in the embedded network is having a problem, but we don't have any visibility into the sector. So we will be looking at doing a fair amount of education, and there will, as we said before, be quite a bit of lead time to let people become aware of what they need to do and register.
The other thing to note is that most other jurisdictions in Australia have some kind of registration requirement for embedded networks. We're sort of an outlier here in WA that there is no visibility over the amount of embedded networks in WA or the customers serviced by them.
So I noticed there was a question about just clarifying the costs that Aurelie replied to in the chat. And then we've got a question, under the new rules framework, will large customers inside embedded networks be able to go on market like in the NEM? So that's a good question, Joseph. Again, Madeline, you want to take that one?
So at this stage, there's no contestability, obviously, in embedded networks. Contestability threshold does not apply in private networks. We have included a provision in the voluntary code, which allows for customers who are of that size, I guess, to have a conversation with their embedded network seller about obtaining a separate master meter and therefore, I guess, exiting the embedded network and being able to access their own contract with a licensed retailer. So that clause is clause 3.2 of the voluntary code. It's really designed to just start that conversation with the ENS. All costs of obtaining that separate master meter would have to be borne by the customer, and we acknowledge that in most situations that cost is going to be really prohibitive. So I guess, yeah, the purpose of that clause is to get that conversation going with the ENS, and I guess for that customer to obtain a reasonable deal at the end of the day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Just interrupt for a moment there. I know that there's a hand up. If you could post your question or comment in the chat, please. We don't have the facility to take verbal questions in this forum. So thanks. Back to you, Sarah and Aurelie.
Thanks, Tim. I think we have largely run through. Oh, wait, there's one. All right, so Catherine has said, how will you ensure all ENSs are aware of this new legislation? Do you know who they all are? And again, great question. No, we don't know who they all are. We will be looking to do a fair bit of education at the point that, you know, this is going to be a thing. So essentially what we're doing at the moment is we are trying to ask a lot of stakeholders, as many as we can reach, is this the appropriate form of regulation, and hopefully get a really balanced response in terms of the kind of stakeholders we have managed to kind of get hold of. We know we haven't reached everyone. So at the point where, say, a decision is taken about whether or not to regulate under the AES, we can then try and go a bit broader with our communications, sort of broad format channels where we'll try and reach as many people as possible. But yeah, education and kind of information about this is going to be a really important thing for us. We acknowledge we are facing a big challenge in terms of getting the message out to everyone who needs to know.
Yeah. We're working obviously with our counterparts at Landgate, Consumer Protection, and any other departments we can to obtain access to and data the numbers of embedded network operators.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of different groups of stakeholders that we need to reach, and not great existing channels that we can leverage to make sure we reach all of them. We're going through industry bodies as much as possible as well to try and get the word out to kind of professionals in the area, like strata managers we're trying to engage with. We're trying to engage with, you know, retirement village associations. We're trying to engage with caravan park operators, but there are a lot of sectors in which embedded networks occur. Not show recording. Thank you, Laurie, for answering that one. Yes, keep an eye on the website. So Paul asked, what process, if any, will apply to brownfield sites looking to convert or retrofit into an embedded network, for example, disclosure requirements, customers, etc.?
Well, the same requirement, the simple answer is that the same requirements will apply as soon as that complex becomes an embedded network. So while they're a multi-master meter complex, each customer's got their relationship with Synergy or with Horizon. If we're talking residential, then they convert to the embedded network the AES code will apply to that ENS who's running that embedded network, and those customers will have access to the Ombudsman, and the ERA will be regulating that space. So really, there's not much more to it.
Yeah. This won't reach back to kind of before something becomes an embedded network. At the moment, there's a requirement to get verifiable consent from all the Synergy account holders, so all the account holders in the various departments, before that building is converted to an embedded network. We're not affecting that process at all, I suppose. It's more that once there is a decision to become an embedded network, the new ENS, before they supply electricity to customers, they will need to give that disclosure statement. But hopefully everybody in the building would be aware of it through strata meetings or through their landlord, that this is coming. Yeah. So Nikki asked, so the Synergy A1 and L1 tariffs are subsidised tariffs that are set with regard to political purposes, which also act as a cap on commercial arrangements within embedded networks. Are the implicit subsidies going to be unwound and replaced with explicit subsidies paid to all customers, including those in embedded networks? Orally, I might throw to you on the subsidisation or not of the A1 or L1. I will just make the comment, though, that we are already seeing in the market, in many cases, quite substantial discounts from the A1 in embedded networks, because it is quite easy to kind of price below that when you're able to aggregate the whole load from a building. You aren't then sort of paying the A1 to your retailer for the building. You're able to buy at a much better rate. Thank you, Orly.
Yeah, so that's essentially exactly what Sarah has said. The residential tariffs and the way that Synergy needs to be the supplier of those customers, the load of residential customers is quite peaky and quite expensive. So usually embedded network customers or customers that can aggregate a lot of points and are able to negotiate much better value contracts than what an A1 customer would cost on average to Synergy. So it's just an economies of scale situation where if you're on an embedded network, it is very likely you can get a better market-based contract, a cents per kilowatt hour price than what it would cost for the A1. And therefore, if that were to be passed on to your customers, you would actually be providing a discount on the A1. And in fact, we know that some embedded network do that.
And this is the primary reason why a lot of people are turning brownfields apartment blocks into embedded networks. It is because they can access power much cheaper if they're buying in bulk, aggregated together, to the point that sometimes they can sort of use those savings to fund the actual infrastructure changes they need to do to put in place the meters and everything else they need for the embedded network. So I don't think you'd find that people will be worse off financially as an embedded network seller than the aggregate of everyone individually. Ayani's got a question, sorry, not a question. If not already, you may wish to engage with Strata Community Association. Thank you. We have engaged with Strata Community Association and we'll continue to, as well as all our other stakeholders through this process. We know there's a lot of stakeholders out there, so if you know of anyone who should be aware of this but isn't, please do direct them to our website. People are welcome to give us an email. We're quite open to talking to people if anyone has questions. Simon's asked, are there plans to extend the existing concessions framework to embedded network customers? So Simon, not in the current form where it's administered through the supplier, the retailer in your instance. What we will have is what we have now, which is the energy concession extension scheme, whereby customers in embedded networks can access energy concessions through applying to Revenue WA. We would just like to have a lot better communication that that scheme is available, because we know that awareness of that scheme is a bit of a roadblock. There's plenty of people who are eligible to concessions in embedded networks who just don't know that they are able to access it in their method.
That's also part of the code, I think, is informing customers of their right to access concessions and how they do that.
Yep. So I think that's all that I'm seeing come up on my end. If there are any last questions, please do pop them in the chat. We know this is a big change for the sector. We know that regulating a sector that has not been regulated to date it can be a very scary prospect. We think we are doing this for the right reasons, which is about making sure customers are protected, and we are trying to keep the regulatory burden as low as possible. We acknowledge, though, that there is a regulatory burden. So again, the CRIS is your opportunity to provide feedback on that. And if you have, the lights have just gone out, been in the room so long. If you have feedback about how to reduce that regulatory burden further or ways to improve what we're proposing, we're very open to those ideas as well.
Just one further question there from Nikki Webster.
Yes, thank you. Doesn't the same logic apply to all of Synergy's resi portfolio? Is that in terms of aggregating the load? Arlie, I've seen you come back on. Do you want to take that one?
So we can talk about load profiles and cost to serve for residential customers in detail, and it's quite an interesting discussion. You can go into long run marginal cost and all sorts of interesting notions, but the A1 portfolio is quite varied. So you'll have some very expensive customers and some very peaky load, and it's a little bit different than an embedded network usually. But we can discuss, the sort of logic of purchasing at scale, purchasing at bulk in detail, but I don't think that this is the forum here now.
And again, we can say with certainty that on the ground, people are offering discounts to the A1 for embedded networks. So it is obviously not a restrictive price cap for at least a large majority of embedded networks out there.
Thank you, Sarah and Madeline, and also Aurelie. I think we probably got through those questions there, so well done. Timing's been good in terms of, I think, sharing of information and questions being able to be put. But that's not the end of it. Of course, there is the opportunity through the information that you now see online to continue to input into this process and continue to ask questions and seek information in terms of how this works. As you've heard on multiple occasions through this process, the key intent is to create an equal set of balance in terms of different customers across embedded networks with customers outside of embedded networks in terms of their rights, without getting too heavy-handed, without impacting unnecessarily through the process. So we are very much seeking to get that balance right. And so very much hoping to continue to engage and get good feedback, good data, good information, so that we can continue to pull the levers in a way that gets that balance right. Sarah, any last comments from you before we look to wrap up?
No, that was a good summation. Thanks, Tim.
We just encourage you, if you are an ENS, to participate in the voluntary period.
Yes.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much all. Look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thanks.